Welcome into the 14. I'm your host, Chris Lee. Blake Lovell alongside me as usual. Blake, we've had a little break in the action other than SEC midweek games. We may touch on those briefly in a minute. But I guess the more important storyline today is the transfer portal and the NBA draft. As we've seen some big names, or maybe not big names in every case, but some significant players maybe hit the portal, hit the NBA waters. Let's talk about that today. First off, I guess the big story is Trey Mann is declared for the draft, which is not a huge surprise.
No, it's not, and I mean, I think he's someone that'll be a first round pick, just based on how he played this season. We looked at, just kind of his ascent and kind of the role he played. We talked about it a lot, what he would have to do, after the Keontae Johnson situation. Trey Mann was going to be a big time player no matter what, but you think about sort of the way that he really carried that Florida team at times, and no surprise he's going to have a pretty nice career just based on his skill set, and I do think he's someone that'll have a pretty good opportunity to make a lot of money at the next level just based on how he plays. Beyond that, like you said, you see someone like that go in, it's not a surprise. I think JT Thor at Auburn is going to test the waters too. But we have to remember at this point, there's no reason why these guys that we know are probably going to have a chance to at least, entertain the thought of playing at the NBA level. There's no reason for them not to do this every offseason now. You have the luxury of doing it. So I think, for guys like JT Thor, and we've seen others that are going to, there'll be other guys once the season's over that'll do the same thing, even at, teams that are still in the NCAA tournament. So not a surprise on those. Obviously, like you said, I think the bigger thing is the transfer portal, which I probably could click here within the next 10 seconds and there will be someone else added to it. So.
Yeah, the transfer portal is filling up quickly. Some names of importance, and we may have touched on some of these before. Savion Flagg at Texas A&M, KJ Buffin at Ole Miss. He's actually landed at UAB, I believe. Ty Fagan at Georgia, who played about half the time for them. That's a big loss for the Bulldogs, I think, potentially. Kevin Marfo, who transferred to A&M, I don't think had quite the role we anticipated. Kadeem C. at Ole Miss, a kid who played some, but not much at the end of the year. Look, it's a transfer epidemic right now, and the SEC not immune to it for sure. Of course, we had a couple of kids from Auburn who entered the portal too earlier of significance we talked about. But what stands out to you here, Blake?
Yeah, I think the biggest two for me at this point are probably Savion Flagg and Xavier Pinson, because I think those two guys, those are two guys that I think we've kind of seen as sort of part of the foundation of those two programs over the past, several years now. And I think anytime, you see guys like that leave, you start to wonder a bit. But, either way, I think we've come to expect this. Like, there are going to be some like this, that's just sort of come out of nowhere that we think after the season. We've seen it so many times now, just given the nature of the transfer portal. And so, I can't say I wasn't surprised by the one with Savion Flagg. I think you have a new coaching staff there in terms of, we've seen other guys too leave Texas A&M. That's just the way it works. Like, and let's think about the season too that the Aggies had. Savion Flagg, someone who came in, a very highly touted recruit type of guy. He worked his way, into the opportunity to kind of be the man there for Texas A&M a couple of years ago, even last year. His numbers maybe weren't as good as they were 2 years ago, but still, he's a very talented player, and I have no doubt that, he'll get a lot of attention in the transfer portal. And then, the Xavier Pinson one, he was someone that we kind of looked at with Missouri and felt like this guy, as a junior, really just has a lot of potential in terms of his scoring ability. We saw it this year. He had the 36-point game against TCU. If you go back to last year, remember, he put up, I think it was, combined 60 points in back-to-back games against Ole Miss and Auburn. And so this guy, you see that potential for someone like him. I think the thought was, he would be one of those guys that would probably test the professional waters as well this offseason. I don't necessarily know that they thought that if he didn't go to the pros or to the NBA or something, that he would not come back to Missouri. So I think that part's a little bit of a surprise. But this is what you expect. And like we said, this is far from done here. There will be other guys that will leave and transfer elsewhere. Now I think your attention turns to if you look at a situation where maybe you have a lot of guys leave a certain school, then maybe you kind of put your eyebrows up a bit and wonder what's going on. We've seen that in some places, but I think for the most part, schools like Ole Miss, Auburn. I mean, those are guys that I don't know. Like, you looked ahead to next year, how big of a factor would they have played given the roster? Those are things you think about too. So it is what it is now with transfer portal. Like I said, I wouldn't be surprised if this thing gets up to 1,500 when all is said and done. Here, I think last year it was like 1,000, maybe I don't know 1,100, something like that. So it's kind of the nature of the beast at this point.
Well, and I'm sure we're nowhere close to being done seeing guys leave for the NBA. Here in Nashville, I'm hearing Scottie Pippen Jr. is going to do that from Vanderbilt. I mean, I think Cam Thomas is probably going to go. I mean, who else can we anticipate hitting the pros? I mean, I think there's a lot of them, but let's just start with the ones that you think that we'll see in the draft.
Yeah, I mean, I think you obviously look at LSU's entire group and you kind of wonder, what's that going to look like for them next year? I think they'll still be fine, probably, in terms of bringing in guys. But yeah, I think you kind of look at that and wonder, what's LSU's roster going to look like next year, especially, you kind of seen what these guys have done and kind of what the possibilities are there. Elsewhere, I don't know. I think it's kind of hard to figure out, who are the other guys. I mean, Tennessee's obviously one. I mean, we know Moses Moody. Look, he's gone. Like, he's probably gonna be a top 10 pick, I would think, most likely. Everyone's kind of projecting Keon Johnson as a top 10 pick and potentially Jaden Springer. I think those are both lottery picks if you just look at some of the mock drafts. The Sharif Cooper thing, I think, is interesting. There are some people that think he may actually come back at this point. I've got to say that just knowing the thought process of how some players that have played for Bruce Pro over the years, I feel like he's a coach that sort of understands the process and says, hey, if you're going to be a lottery pick, he's not going to be one that's going to say, hey, I need to be begging you to come back. I mean, obviously Auburn would love to have him next year, but if Sharif Cooper's going to be a lottery pick or, a for sure first round pick, I just don't see it. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but I don't see that either. And then, Kentucky, the usual ones. I mean, I think you'll have BJ Boston, you'll have some of these other guys, and probably Isaiah Jackson in that mix. So that's just, I mean, the SEC, we've seen it over the years. If you just look at the numbers, even outside of Kentucky now, like the SEC has gotten a lot of guys that have gone, in the top part of the draft, and that's why you're seeing some of these guys leave so early, is because the SEC's kind of gotten to that point to where they get a lot of guys in the first round. Again, it's not just Kentucky anymore. So Cam Thomas should be a first-round pick, and then you look at the other guys, what do some of them do? But, yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, there's going to be a lot of talent leaving the SEC. It's just a matter of, knowing that there's going to be more coming in as well. So
Kentucky, I presume, would lose Boston, Clark, and Isaiah Jackson.
That seems right to me. I think if you look at I guess some of the mock drafts I've looked at, I mean, Boston's probably the highest of that group. Jackson's probably not too far behind him. At least that's just from some of the ones I've seen, which, mock drafts can be all over the place. But that's kind of what I'm thinking. And then from there, I mean, look, they had some older guys too this year, as we know, in terms of guys who came in as transfers. And so I'm sure that they'll do that too. They'll be back in a situation where they kind of put themselves there. But, those are the teams like Kentucky and like we said, Tennessee now. Think about Tennessee. If they lose Keon Johnson and Jaden Springer, which most people think they're going to, as lottery picks, that's a lot to make up too, in terms of what they're going to be able to do next year. Now, I know, who is it? Rick Barnes has got, was it Kennedy Chandler comes in next year? Is that right? I think
so. Yeah.
Yeah, he comes in next year. So that's a point guard spot that, we'll be able to give them kind of that extra boost they need. If they do lose both those guys, which, like we said, we're kind of projecting that at this point. So I think we look at it from that standpoint. Kentucky, Tennessee, those are two teams to really keep an eye on as usual, because that's just kind of what the nature is. And then we know with Tennessee, they had some older guys too that, with Pons and Fulkerson. I know we've talked about, will some of these guys come back and all that stuff, given the eligibility situation. That's another thing to sort of keep in mind. So.
Well, Tennessee will lose Eve Pons too,
right?
I think. I mean, he could have gone last year and didn't. Yeah, I mean, my goodness, the landscape of the league, just as they're getting it together, it seems like it could change in an instant, although I don't know that that's out of the norm for a power conference. But it does seem like the SEC has an unusual number of players who could go pro compared to most years. Maybe that's just me, but I think you could see heavy losses in this league.
Well, that too, and the SEC from an experience standpoint. I know last year, I want to say, if you looked at the numbers, like there were a ton of SEC teams that were in the, if you look at Ken Baum's, experience ranking and all that, like we like to do, there were a ton of teams that were like in the bottom tier of that just because they were relying on a lot of freshmen. I think this year you had a little bit more experience because, you did see some teams go out and get grad transfers. That helped in terms of the numbers overall. But still, I mean, it's a league that because of how well they recruit, you're always going to have a lot of freshmen on the floor. And then, most of these kids who recruit, if not, half of them, maybe even more than half sometimes, these are going to be guys that may play a year and they may be gone to the NBA. So, yeah, that's it's a juggling act, I think, for coaches, knowing that, hey, experience still matters, but at the same time, you want to fill your roster with the best available players. And so that's something, too, where it's kind of mixing both. And I think we've seen some of these teams really excel at that. I mean, Eric Musselman, I think, is someone that I would certainly point to, and I think Nate Oates is pretty much there now, too, even though, Oates, for the most part, yes, they brought in Jordan Bruner, but, he's had guys, too, that have been there, like Herbert Jones and John Petty, but he's also brought in a lot of talented freshmen. Obviously, with Musselman, he brings in talented freshmen like Moses Moody, but he has older guys to come in like Justin Smith and, J.D. Note and Jalen Tate and guys like that. So I think it's gotten to the point to where if you can kind of have that nice balance, because you can't just build, I think, off of freshmen anymore. You have to, and look, we've seen Kentucky do that, right? Like they're the poster child for that. They used to just try to do that, was just build off of freshmen. Now I think they're starting to say, hey, maybe we need to get some of these older guys to kind of add a little bit more experience. So I think it's become quite a juggling act for coaches.
Well, I'm looking at who the league has landed, and frankly, not a lot so far. Zep Jasper goes to Auburn, I believe from Charleston, where Earl Grant left for, was it Boston College?
Yes, he went there. Yep.
Yeah, so a lot of times when you see a coaching change, you see players leave. He averaged 15.6, 3.7 boards, 2.6 assists, and averaged almost 32 minutes a game. So I would think he'd be one who could plug in nicely for Auburn. Seneca Knight at San Jose State, who opted out of the season, averaged 17.1 points, 5.7 rebounds 2 seasons ago there. He lands at LSU. And, of course, the big one, Oscar Tshiebwe, who leaves West Virginia for Kentucky. And that's one that we've known about for a while that I think will have a big impact. But right now, as I look at this, most of these guys are leaving the SEC in a lot of places. Like some of these players, we're looking at the transfer portal. I'm like, I don't even know who that guy is.
Yeah.
I think maybe some walk-ons there, some freshmen or sophomores who barely played. But so far, not a lot incoming. And really, frankly, some of these players who are leaving, I mean, not exactly like a lot of huge. I guess Xavier Pinson may be the biggest one. Savion Flag, Auburn aside, we've talked about that before, but not. Ty Fagan one that hurts Georgia too, but a lot in terms of the numbers. A lot of these kids, not guys who were going to be super duper major contributors for their teams next year.
Yeah, and that's the thing too. Is like we said, we've sort of come to expect this because we know. I think coaches know that there are going to be so many other guys out there now, just given the nature of the situation. There's just going to be so many more kids available. And, if you're a kid that doesn't play at a school and you're not really factored into rotation, I mean, it doesn't hurt you. Like, you just might as well leave, and you're probably going to be able to find an opportunity elsewhere because you know that there are other schools probably losing a couple kids too. So it's just a matter of finding the right fit. I think the most intriguing part now is to see, who some of the SEC teams land, which is so hard to predict. There's no way of knowing. I know I saw one of the things report before we started recording. C.J. Felder, who was at Boston College, you talked about Earl Grant taking that job. Supposedly he's met with A&M in Florida to this point. I think he met with Xavier also. So he's a nice, 6'7" big man that averaged about 10 points, 6 rebounds last year at Boston College, or this season at Boston College. So he's someone that would be a nice pickup for them. Just as we started recording, Parker Stewart, who, as we know, was the son of Anthony Stewart, who tragically passed away head coach at UT Martin. Parker Stewart just entered the transfer portal. Was just reported literally probably 10 minutes ago. So he's someone else that I know was recruited, by a couple of different FCC schools. And Ole Miss was certainly in the mix for him. Some of the others. So that's another name to kind of keep an eye on with that. So yeah, it's just it's hard to keep up with a lot of transfers, but it's just kind of the nature of the game at this point.
Yeah, Parker Stewart will be a big get for somebody. He's a
Yeah.
kid who I did a thing on him, or was going to maybe do a thing on him at Blue Ribbon. And man, that was so tragic when his father, who was a coach at UT Martin, um, Anthony Stewart, passed. Really liked that guy, but he was very proud of Parker. Parker had already was finishing his master's degree and was about to try to get some kind of exemption to do a doctoral program. I think at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, there was a rule that you could do that and he could stay at Martin. And then, of course, his dad passes right before the season. Just stunned everybody. The guy was 50 years old and was a great story. Parker had gone to Indiana
Yep.
and hit the transfer portal. Then, of course, Archie Miller lost the job. But, yeah, he'll be a big get for somebody. And I do wonder if he might land somewhere in this area because, obviously, he's from West Tennessee. And so I don't know. That'll be an interesting one to watch. Coaching news, Kim English has left Tennessee and taken the job at George Mason, I believe.
Yep, Kim English headed to George Mason. He was one of the names we mentioned when we had that conversation. I guess it's been a couple weeks ago now about the SEC assistants to kind of keep an eye on here. We didn't know, would that be this year or next year or something, but I think he was always going to be someone that was going to be near the top of the list for a lot of different guys. He's a Baltimore guy. I think going to George Mason, there's just a lot of things there that makes sense. But I think it's a great hire for George Mason, but it's also, we can't lie. Like it's a pretty big loss for Tennessee in terms of their staff. He is someone that we talked about Kennedy Chandler earlier. Like Kim English was the primary recruiter for Kennedy Chandler. So he was someone that really played a big role in Tennessee's recruiting. And so I think, I'd probably have to look at it, but I assume that he probably played a pretty big hand in guys like Springer and Johnson too. So, that's one with Tennessee. They've lost a couple different assistants, which, it is what it is too. It's like, they lost Rob Lanier to Georgia State. He was a big time part of that staff in terms of recruiting. Now they lose Kim English. Rick Barnes has enough connections that I think he'll be fine in terms of bringing guys in. But yeah, that's a great hire for George Mason. I think that Kim English, still only 32 years old now. Of course, we all remember him playing at Missouri, just a fantastic player. But yeah, just someone that I think is kind of one of those guys you label as a rising star in the business, and he will certainly have an opportunity, I think, to have a lot of success there. But Tennessee now needing someone else, like I said, to kind of maybe lead some of that recruiting that they're going to miss from him being gone. So
Yeah, Tennessee suddenly seems like the landscape is changing there. I thought that Rick Barnes really had it going on, and I'm not saying that he doesn't, right? But you lose potentially Springer and Johnson. Pons is gone. Fulkerson is gone. I presume they're gone. You can stay another year and come back if you're a senior, but people across the country don't seem to be doing that. All of a sudden, that's a program that has got a good bit of uncertainty, I think, with it heading forward. As you noted, Tennessee landed a coveted five-star player and landed a four-star kid, too, according to Rivals in the next year's class. But boy, if you lose Springer and Keon Johnson, which again at this point we're speculating that's not happened, and then you lose Kim English, all of a sudden things in Knoxville are, I don't know if the word dicey is fair, right? But this is a program that a year ago we're saying this is a top 10 program in the country and should be for the foreseeable future, and now I'm not nearly as sure.
yeah, and they're gonna have to be a program too that works the transfer portal quite a bit, I would think, because like you said, if you lose Johnson, you lose Springer, you still assume that Kennedy Chandler's going to be there. Even though English, as we said, was a big part of the recruiting, but I can't, there's no reason now to speculate that that's going to be any different. But really, when you look at the rest of the roster, right? Like you said, I don't know how many of these guys, in terms of the senior guys, like you said, are really going to take that opportunity to come back another season. You'll see some, but some of these guys are just going to have opportunities to play professional, even if it's not in the NBA. There should be, at least to that point, if the landscape's a little bit closer to normal. I don't want to say it's going to be completely normal yet, but they'll have more opportunities maybe to find games, find teams overseas and such. They're going to have to kind of find some guys on the transfer portal. Like they brought in EJ Anosike last year, the grad transfer from Sacred Heart. I mean, he barely played this season. So I think that they're going to have to kind of go swinging pretty high, I think, for Tennessee to be able to know that they're going to have to replace some of those guys. And they're a team that I think has a pretty hard to get a read on going into next season. I can't say that I'm going to be as high on Tennessee as I am, probably on some of these other teams ahead of them, just because I don't really know what to expect from the roster going into next year.
Anything else related to the SEC or college basketball before we flip to baseball for just a second?
I've started to look ahead at the actually doing the numbers, the matchups for these Sweet 16 games with Alabama, UCLA, Arkansas, and Oral Roberts. I said it before. If you look at the one thing in common with a team like Maryland and UCLA, it's that they play at a really slow tempo, or that's how they like to play. And I think we've just seen it so many times this year for teams that try to do that against Alabama. It doesn't really work. So I really think that this is, again, the same situation to me, in that I think if Alabama can force the tempo, I really think they're going to have an opportunity to, I don't want to say they're going to win this game by 20 like they did against Maryland, but like I could see Alabama winning this game by double digits, just depending on how the matchup goes with the tempo, because we've just seen it. We've always said the offense versus the defense thing, and UCLA is a pretty good offensive team, but Alabama, once again, one of the best defensive teams in the country, and they completely will play a different tempo than UCLA is used to. So I think I look at that matchup, and I feel okay about it right now for Alabama. With Arkansas and Oral Roberts, I'm very interested to see kind of what things are going to look, and we'll talk more about this throughout the week, but I'm already looking at some of the situations of what Arkansas can do offensively, because Oral Roberts, as we said, is not a great defensive team. One of the things that I think that if you're Arkansas, you just have to defend the three. We know how good Oral Roberts is from the three-point line. I think kind of digging more into that, Arkansas is okay at defending the three. But they really haven't had to worry about that a whole lot at times, because, as we said, the SEC overall, you don't have a lot of great three-point shooting teams. So maybe the stats are a little bit misleading there, but that is something, if you want to look ahead at the early matchups, certainly I think you lean in Alabama and Arkansas's favor, but you can certainly find some things that make you think that, boy, this is, these are really nice matchups on paper for both of those teams.
What's your theory on three-point defense? Because some people think that's kind of luck, and I'm sure there's an element of it to it, but obviously you can't just give people wide open three-point shots. And, there's a difference between contesting shots and not. But I think that opinions on that are a little bit murky. I'm just curious as to where you stand.
Well, and that's the thing is, I think you always have to keep it in perspective, in that it's really, your numbers come down to also who you play and what the strengths are of the teams that you play against. Like I said, if you look at some of the ones, look at Alabama's three-point field goal defense. Like they're 8th in the country, 28.9%. But if you really look around, they played a lot of SEC games. Like, who are the just completely standout three-point SEC teams that I can't name any. Like, maybe there's some I'm forgetting, but aside from Alabama, there's not a lot of SEC teams that just are so overwhelmingly good from the three-point line that you're going to say, wow, they held that team to that percentage or anything. So I think that's something you always have to look at with that as perspective. And look, I looked up one of the stats yesterday. For example, UCLA's only given up more than 10 three-pointers once this season. So they've only had one game where they've given up a team to shoot or make more than 10 three-pointers. Alabama has done that 14 times this year. They've made 10 or more than 10 14 times. So, but you also have to remember that possession-wise, it's a different game, right? Because UCLA plays such a slower tempo. Alabama plays such a faster tempo. So you could see Alabama, when they force the tempo on teams, making that many three-pointers. Whereas UCLA, they haven't given up a ton, but when you look at actually the percentages, UCLA is they're one of the bottom teams. And again, I don't know how far towards the bottom, but they're in the lower half. I'll say that for sure. And when it comes to 3-point percentage, or teams that shoot a really high percentage against them. So those are the kind of things you have to look at deeper, I think, when you look at 3-point defense and really just 3-point shooting in general, whether it's offense or defense. It's also about the style. It's about who you play. And so that it can be a stat that's a little bit misleading at times if you just go by the numbers that you see on paper. So,
okay, I'm looking at conference-only stats, 3-point percentage in the league this year. Alabama was 1. Without looking, give me 2, 3, and 4.
I'm
going to tell you right now, one of these is going to floor you.
Well, I know Vanderbilt's one of them.
Okay, Vanderbilt's 2,
yeah.
And that's not a surprise. I mean,
no.
Vanderbilt didn't have a lot of great shooters, but it would get somebody hot every other night. Pippen would hit a few. 3 and 4. If you get, you may get one of these because we've talked about it before, but if you get the other one, I'll be surprised.
Mississippi State.
No, State. Well, you're close. They were 6th. And look, there's not a lot of difference between these. It's a couple of points, but.
Let's see. I'm gonna get this. Looking around. I'm not looking at it. I'm trying to think of the SEC overall here. I mean, Georgia.
No, Georgia was up there for a while and finished 9th. I'll just go ahead and tell you. And actually, this team tied with Vanderbilt at 2nd. I guess Vanderbilt won the tiebreaker to a couple of decimal points. Both these teams hit 36.2%, Vanderbilt and Kentucky.
Wow.
Followed by Florida.
I would not have guessed Kentucky.
No, Kentucky, I'm like, where did that come from?
They had a strong finish, I think, from the 3. And they had some pretty good games down the stretch, but they were just so awful early. So
Now the bottom teams won't surprise you. A&M last and Ole Miss next to last.
Yeah.
Followed in worse order by South Carolina and Tennessee. So
yeah. Well, that's like I said. It's just I think that's what you look at sometimes with these stats. They can be a little bit interesting because you have to remember you put it in the scope of what you do against teams like that. And that's the thing too. Like UCLA's, I think they're in the top 30 in 3-point percentage, but they don't get a lot of their points from there. And so, like, that's something, too. You have to remember, like, if they shoot a high percentage, that's great. But if they don't necessarily shoot a lot of them, sometimes it's not as big of a deal. So you have to dig a little bit deeper on these numbers to kind of get the full story on them, I think.
Well, you talked about UCLA trying to slow Alabama. And there's 2 elements to tempo, right? There's offense and defense. And UCLA is going to play kind of a more grinded out style. I mean, we say grinded out. You look at average possession length. And like if you're in 14 seconds, that range, that's top 5 in the country. If you're around 18, that's in the mid to high 200s. So, I mean, I think sometimes this is a little bit overrated, although 4 seconds repeated, 60 times, 70 times across a game, I guess that adds up, right?
Yeah.
But UCLA can try to do it, but Alabama's approach is basically seems to be like, let's take the first open look we can get. Between that and they rotate the ball so quickly. They have such good ball handlers in Quinterly and Shackelford, and then add in Herb Jones. But it's one of those things that you can try to do. I'm just not sure how Mick Cronin is going to be able to pull that off in terms of just really gumming up the gears for Alabama's offense. I mean, you can try, but I don't know how they pull that off.
Yeah, I don't know either, and that's what we said. We've always kind of talked about that. What was, I think, it's sort of similar to the conversation we had with LSU in that when they played a team like Ole Miss, who was a great defensive team, and look, by no means is UCLA a great defensive team, but we said we just felt like the offense was going to be able to overpower the defense. And I think, in that scenario where you had 2 teams like LSU and Ole Miss that played on different sort of ends of the spectrum when it came to pace and all that stuff, you just felt like there was a really good opportunity there for them to kind of take advantage of that. And if you look back at what Alabama did against some of those teams, I think for the most part, like when you look at it, I feel like Alabama really excelled down the stretch. Now, early in the season, I think that's different. Like they lost to a team like Clemson, who was able to do something like that. They were able to kind of grind that game out. And Clemson plays a much, slower pace anyways. But I just think overall, when you look at it, I just feel like if you put yourself in a situation, which is what Maryland could not slow Alabama down. They could not do it, and you were not going to win a game. Now, certainly Alabama hit a lot of shots, and that's the name of the game, though. But if UCLA tries to get up and down the floor and match Alabama shot for shot, it ain't happening. Because I think Alabama will be able to find a way to probably defend Johnny Juzang pretty well. That's certainly a guy you have to keep your eye on in terms of the 3-point percentage. If UCLA can get hot from three, that will give them a really good chance here. But I just feel like if it's a good matchup, man, I look at it overall, and I don't want to say it's exactly like the matchup with Maryland, but you can see some similarities between Maryland and UCLA and how they play.
You mentioned Johnny Juzang. I was watching UCLA the other night. I'm thinking, how much could Kentucky have used that kid last year?
Kentucky would have been a different team if they just had one guy like that. And that's the thing is I feel like Cal knows that, and he's had those guys before. This team, it just, and maybe he's banking on having someone like that this season, because if they did, like that's just a huge difference. If they just have one guy that can consistently knock down a three, and they've had those guys over the years, right? You could probably go down to each of these teams and say, oh, there's that guy. Maybe he wasn't the superstar, but that guy could come in and knock down a three. And I mean, I'm trying to think of like Derek Willis, guys like that who, Derek Willis is a pretty good player overall, but like those were the kind of guys that could just knock down shots and really give them a different element that really helped those kind of teams. So.
Who was the kid on Darius Miller is who it was.
Yeah, Darius Miller.
And Terrence Jones could step out and hit a three, but that Kentucky team, I've not seen one in the SEC that I liked as much since then. Goodness gracious, it's been 9 years now.
Yeah.
Doesn't seem like it. But that team was a thing of beauty because, and of course, gosh, that also seems in a way like it was forever ago, because you had kind of a back-to-the-basket big and Anthony Davis. You had a big stretch four type guy with Jones who could take you outside or get you inside, take you off the dribble. You had Michael Kidd, Gilchrist, and Teague. And I really liked Darius Miller. I thought he was an underrated contributor to that team. But I just felt like that was the perfectly constructed team. I'm probably wishing for an era that's past us and is not coming back, because I enjoy the back-to-the-basket kind of big. And maybe my memory fades. Maybe Davis played more face up. But, I mean, when you think bigs and you think now compared to what they were then, I do think things have changed. But, yeah, you're right. I mean, Kentucky just seems like, as we've said, just hasn't had that type of shooter as frequently as it did in the past.
Yeah, I was thinking Jamal Murray back in 2015-16. That's that was a big one, which that team had Jamal Murray and had Derek Willis on it, which, Willis's numbers weren't perfect, but he still was a guy you felt pretty confident that he's going to be able to knock down shots. Tyler Hero is the one I was thinking of most recently, but, it's still like I feel like he is elevated into an NBA player much more than we thought he would be just based on what he did at Kentucky. Now, he was a good player, but man, that you talk about someone that's really taking advantage of their opportunity. There's a guy that's certainly done that. And then, before that, like you said, you can go back to all those different teams and just kind of look at it. I mean, the Devin Booker and guys like that, which Booker's another guy who you talk about just completely taking off. He's another one that kind of did that once he got to the NBA. So.
Deron Lamb was on that Kentucky team too.
Yeah, that's the thing is I feel like if they just go out and each offseason say we got to get one of the top 10 shooters in the country. I don't care how we do it, whether it's transfer portal, whether it's freshmen, we got to go out every single year and have a top 10 shooter on our team. Kentucky would be exactly where we think they're going to be every single season. I just think that's the one missing element, which you and I have talked about that a lot on this podcast before. That can be such a great equalizer, right? Just ask Oral Roberts. Like, I mean, they're in the Sweet 16, and they're one of the best 3-point shooting teams in the country. So it can be such a big part of how you have success this time of year. So.
Man, I'm starting to think of shooters coming back for this year in this league, and I'm just not getting a lot who come to mind. I mean, most of them are those, point guard type guys who, like a Pippen who will shoot in volume at times. And again, I think he's gone anyway. Probably he's going to declare for the draft, from what I hear. But
yeah, I'm trying to think.
You take Cam Thomas out of it, and I'm just going, my goodness, this league has got to find some between now and next year.
Yeah, like I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I mean, I'm sure Alabama will have some guys coming back that can shoot it. But beyond that, like, who are the guys that are out there? I'm sure if I went through the rosters, I'd say, oh, yeah, I forgot about that guy. But, yeah, there's not a ton. So that'll be interesting, and I'm sure that'll be a very valuable asset in the transfer portal. So.
Let's put a bow on basketball here before we talk baseball just briefly. Anything else we didn't get to on hoops today?
No, I think, like we said, it's just a matter of we'll talk more about the Sweet 16 games coming up, and yeah, just more transfers. I'm sure, like I could reload the verbal commits page right here, and there's probably been 5 transfers since we started recording. 30 minutes ago. So that's just it's hard to keep up with.
SEC baseball, the league goes 7-2 on Tuesday. Let's see who lost. A&M lost a 2-1 game to Rice, and Southern Miss beat Alabama 5-4. I don't know that those are crippling losses. Well, I mean there aren't in baseball, but in any case, not a lot of news there. I guess the biggest news was Tate Colwick at Vanderbilt, who's that team's leading home run hitter and starting second baseman. It's got a hand issue. I think that maybe he hurt his hand this weekend and aggravated it during an at-bat. He left the game last night. Tim Corbin said after the game, Dad, he's expecting to have surgery that he thinks. I don't think this has been verified yet, but I think this was just Tim Corbin speaking off the cuff. So Vanderbilt went it through Parker Nolan, who's been at third for them some at second, and brought Jason Gonzalez, who was on the bench for that game, off the bench to go to third. So I think Vandy's got some depth, but that was a kid who was really hitting the ball for him. He hit 2 home runs in the Saturday game and was really coming alive. And so that's a potential loss for Vanderbilt. Now, Vanderbilt really deep, Blake, but you don't want to lose a kid who's playing airless ball at second and leading your team in home runs, and that may be the case for the Commodores.
Yeah, right, and especially not in a league like this, as you guys have talked about and we talked about before. Just given the pitching too, I think that's a valuable asset to have. So certainly not an ideal when you're looking ahead. That, like we said, for the top team in the country at this point. So certainly a storyline to keep an eye on. And like you said, I'm still to the point now where obviously I'm watching a lot of basketball, but trying to also look at some of these. I don't know what I guess trends would probably be the best thing. Like what are some of the trends we see, and when you see some of these midweek games. It's hard to kind of figure out because, like we said, we see this so many times throughout the years where you have some of these midweek games and, maybe they don't go in the favor of some of these SEC teams. And all of a sudden you come out and have your weekend series and you look great. But I'm curious to kind of, look at some of those series. Obviously, the biggest ones I know we'll talk about with Barry on Thursday. But, you look ahead to Arkansas, Mississippi State, and Florida, South Carolina, Tennessee, LSU, ones like that. So, I'm very fascinated to kind of see how some of those series play out as we head into the weekend. So,
how about this for you as a trend? Winning.
Yes, that's
that's
exactly
a lot of it.
Right. Yes, that's the best way to do it is to just win. Because like for the most part, certainly you'll have some games against teams that are kind of somewhere on your level, but a lot of these midweek games we know sometimes they're just sort of you should outclass your opponents and. Not always the case, though, as we said, with teams who kind of lose some of these games. I guess who was it? Texas A&M and Alabama were on the wrong end of that on Tuesday. But you would like to win more than you would like to lose. That's for sure.
Well, there's only one team with the losing record at this point. That's Missouri, which is 8-12. That's just not a good ball club. Other than that, I think Barry is on to something. He's been watching Auburn's bullpen. He's worried about their arms. I am too. So I think Auburn is kind of that team that a lot of us thought was headed for a regional. And look, I wouldn't count Butch Thompson out because he's an outstanding coach, A. And B, we've seen this before with the Tigers. Like 2 years ago, Auburn was a top 25 preseason team, didn't play like it a lot of the year, maybe had some injury issues, maybe just as importantly, had some kids like Steven Williams, and goodness, I forget the name of the shortstop now. Holland, I think he's in the pros now. But those kids, they had maybe their top 3 or 4 bats just didn't hit to the level they expected, and all of a sudden they get in the NCAA tournament, and bam, here come the bats. And if not for Edouard Julian's meltdown at third base in the late innings of a game in Omaha against Mississippi State, that team might have advanced and won a couple of games in Omaha, but it was a shock to see them get there. So I don't want to count Auburn out because I've seen Butch Thompson kind of salvage things from the fire before, but that's a team I'm concerned about. Other than that, Kentucky, the team that I've kind of got my eye on, I don't really know if this is a 14-4 start because of the schedule, or if this is really an improved Kentucky team. The pitching's better than we thought. But I think you could see legitimately 10, 11, maybe 12 tournament teams. I think the 12 is going to be too many. But I do think that you could see the league get into double digits. Alabama, another one that I'm wondering about. I want to see that team get into conference play and how it does. The pre-lip situation there obviously is one that could cripple Alabama. And frankly, when you get into league, Blake, you look for reasons that it can't work because it's just going to be a brutal grind. And so I'm watching. I really think you put more emphasis on the red flags in this league maybe than you do other places because it is so brutal. So Alabama, a team that I'm kind of watching to see how does it handle pre-lip. Auburn, a team I'm kind of watching to see if he can come up with some better pitching options. And Kentucky, a team I'm just kind of watching because I just don't know. But I think everybody else, is looking set for the field of 64 here in a couple of months.
Well, and it's fitting, isn't it, that I was gonna bring it up too about Auburn and Kentucky. Like they play each other this weekend, and I feel like that's just such a huge series for both because when you look ahead, which as we know in the SEC, like for the most part, you've got to grind. I mean, you're going to be playing a very good team every weekend, but like those two play each other this weekend. After that, Auburn goes to Arkansas, and then they've got Mississippi State, and then they'd go to Alabama after that, and I think it's Florida. So, like, especially if you look ahead just in the next 6 games after the Kentucky series for Auburn in the league, like at Arkansas, Mississippi State, that's tough. So you feel like that's a big series for Auburn, certainly against Kentucky. But then when you look at Kentucky's schedule, it's like, well, they go to Auburn this weekend, and then they've got to go to Mississippi State. They've got the midweek game at Louisville, and then they come back home to play LSU. So those are two that I'm very intrigued by in terms of seeing how things kind of turn out for them over the next 2 weeks, I guess. Because like you said, if you have questions about them now, you look at their schedule, boy, this is a really big 3-game set, I feel like, for both teams. If you see one of those teams come out and, I don't know, even pull off a sweep, which I don't think is going to happen, I feel like this will probably be a pretty, somewhat even series, you would think. But man, this is it's a pretty big, I think it's a pretty big series when you look ahead for those two teams specifically, so.
Yeah, that's a great point because if you're Auburn and you lose this series to Kentucky, let's say you lose it 2-1, you're 1-5 in the league, then you're staring down at Arkansas, Mississippi State at home the next 2 weeks, then at Alabama, Florida, at Georgia, LSU,
Yeah.
and A&M, both those two series at home. And then you go to Columbia where it eases up, and maybe that's your medicine at the end. But you can get buried so far underwater in this thing that A, you don't make it to Hoover, and B, you can lose your confidence. So I think that's the one to me that I'm watching is if Auburn can't beat Kentucky, then you start looking ahead, and it's really hard to find a path to the NCAA tournament, I think, for this team.
Yeah, I think you're spot on with that because I look ahead and as you say, right now, you don't, you can only project out what we've seen this far, and you don't really project that they're going to win the series at Arkansas. You don't project they're going to win a series against Mississippi State. They also have a game, by the way, too, at Georgia Tech in there in mid-April, and they go to Alabama. So this is a grind, I think, for Auburn here over the next 3 weeks or so. And as we said, somewhat when you look at Kentucky, somewhat similar when you think about, they're on the road here for this one against Auburn. They've got to go on the road against Mississippi State, on the road at Louisville, then come back home against LSU. So, yeah, these are two teams to certainly keep an eye on in terms of what's the outlook, what's the ceiling for these two teams, because as you said, you could find yourself spinning out in a hurry here just based on the competition in this league. So.
Yeah, Ole Miss, another one to watch. The Rebels just got the short end of the SEC stick. At Alabama, that's, I think, a key series for both teams. I mean, my goodness, beyond that, here's Ole Miss's schedule after that. At Florida, Arkansas, at Mississippi State, LSU, South Carolina, at A&M, Vandy, at Georgia. So
yeah,
all teams that right now I would say are going to be in the NCAA tournament. That's where Gosh, Ole Miss is going to be there, I think, but I just think it's going to be really hard for the Rebels to win the league because of that schedule.
Yeah, next six SEC games on the road, like you said, at Alabama and Florida, and then you come back home for Arkansas, which again, like that, how much does that mean? I don't know. And then you just got to turn around and go to Mississippi State. It's just that's a brutal schedule for anybody. I don't care if you're the number 3 team, the number 1 team, the number 50 team. It's that's brutal. So going to be a struggle for the Rebels there. But hey, you know what? If you win those games, if you win the majority of those games, that tells you a lot more about them, because that means you're a pretty dang good team if you can come out with a pretty good record after that kind of slate. So
yeah, Ole Miss is one of those teams that it could go 17-13 in the league and probably get a national seed, because the strength of schedule is going to be that difficult. Of course, it started the year with wins against TCU, Texas Tech, and Texas, all top 25 teams. So, it lost a series to UCF, which, probably won't be a terrible RPI team. But Ole Miss, one of those teams that, like, even if they go 16-14 in the league, I think that's going to be a slam dunk host.
Yeah, because like you said, if you just run through their schedule and you find where those wins are coming from, they've got to come against good teams somewhere, because that's pretty much all they play the rest of the way, like we said, in SEC play. So, yeah, I think that they would be sitting in a good spot in that scenario.
All right. Parting thoughts as we end the podcast. Tell folks where people can find us on social media, all those sorts of things.
Yep, southeastern14.com. Check out everything there. And, we just got a lot of stuff we'll continue to have going up here throughout the tournament. And as we go throughout SEC baseball, and, just lots happening. We'll talk more about the Sweet 16 matchups coming up here over the next couple of days. We'll have Barry on to talk about the weekend series in baseball. And so, check everything out there. Subscribe to the podcast, any podcast app you use. And, we appreciate the support and the feedback as always.
All right. For Blake Lovell, I'm Chris Lee, host of the 14. Thank you for listening. We will be back with another episode on Thursday.